On a cold and haunting Chicago night, Jasmine Jazz Banks, a renowned celebrity stripper who had captivated the nightlife scene, was found shot dead inside her sleek black SUV, parked outside one of the city's most exclusive high-rise apartment buildings. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, a routine drop-off after a glamorous show, but fate had other plans. Moments before her death, Jazz had been engaged in a heated argument with one of her high-profile clients, a powerful businessman known for his connections to Chicago's underworld. Their words, filled with rage and desperation, echoed through the car's interior, a sign of the unraveling tension between them. But what made the scene even more chilling? The entire argument, filled with rising threats and promises of retribution, was caught on a hidden camera, a recording that would hold the key to unraveling the mystery of her death. This is a story about how a popular Chicago celebrity stripper was killed and the chilling secrets that led to her untimely demise. Jasmine Jazz Banks wasn't just another name in Chicago's nightlife scene. She was a star. At just 27 years old, Jazz had already built a reputation as one of the most sought-after celebrity strippers in the city. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her confidence, charisma, and fierce independence that made her a household name in the world of high-end clubs and exclusive events. Whether she was performing at the city's most upscale gentlemen's clubs or attending private parties with the city's elite, Jazz was the embodiment of power and allure. Born and raised on Chicago's South Side, Jazz had always dreamed of something more than the life she grew up with. She was determined, ambitious, and knew how to work a room and the spotlight. With striking features and an intoxicating presence, Jazz quickly rose to fame, becoming a fixture in both the club scene and on social media. Her Instagram was a collection of her fiercest poses, showing off her work as much as her persona. She wasn't just a stripper, she was a brand. And in the world of luxury and excess, her followers worshipped her every move. But behind the glamorous persona and designer clothes, Jazz had a life filled with complexities few knew about. The glitz and glamour were often a distraction from the loneliness that gnawed at her. She had always wanted more than just to be seen as an object of desire. She longed to be respected, to be remembered for her skill, her drive, and the dreams she was working to achieve. Jazz had big plans. She was looking to branch out, to build an empire beyond the clubs, and to take her career into a new direction. Her next step was more personal, becoming a mother for the second time. She was 3 months pregnant, eagerly awaiting the arrival of her son, who she already affectionately called Baby J. In the quiet moments, away from the lights and the cheers of her fans, Jazz was still a mother first. Her 9-year-old daughter, Ava, was her world. Jazz had fought hard to build a life for herself and her daughter, and despite the chaos of her career, her love for Ava was unwavering. Her family was her foundation, the one thing that kept her grounded amidst the whirlwind of fame. But fame, as Jazz had learned, came with its own set of dangers. The higher she climbed, the more entangled she became with people whose motives were often unclear and whose intentions were darker than they seemed. And that night, as she sat in her car preparing for yet another evening of glamour, she had no idea that everything she had worked for and the life she was trying to build was about to be ripped away in an instant. As Jazz prepared for the exclusive party hosted by one of her most influential clients, Chaz Westbrook, she knew this event could be a major turning point for her career. Chaz, a business mogul with vast wealth and connections, had become a regular fixture in her life. He was the type of man who could elevate her brand, push her into the spotlight of mainstream fame, and give her the kind of access and recognition she'd only dreamed of. The party he was throwing was an invitation-only affair, designed to be an intimate gathering of Chicago's elite, a perfect opportunity for Jazz to secure bigger deals and expand her reach. But despite the promises of wealth and influence, Jazz couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her relationship with Chaz had always been complicated. What started as a simple business arrangement, a client relationship, had escalated into something far more entangled. Chaz, with his magnetic charm and ruthless ambition, had made it clear that he wanted more than just Jazz's talents. As his personal attachment to her grew, so did the tension between them. Chaz's jealousy had been palpable for months. He became possessive, trying to control who Jazz worked with and where she performed. Though he admired her independence and strength, he resented her refusal to be tied down by anyone, especially him. His advances had become more frequent, more intense, and more difficult for Jazz to ignore. But she remained steadfast in her determination to keep their relationship strictly professional. She had no interest in becoming entangled with a man like Chaz, especially given the darker side of his world that she had glimpsed in passing. Jazz knew that to continue climbing the ladder of success, she couldn't afford distractions. Not now, not when she was on the verge of securing a mainstream deal that could take her career to new heights. But her refusal to get involved with Chaz personally only fueled his resentment. What started as admiration turned into an obsession, and despite her attempts to push him away, Chaz's feelings were becoming more difficult to ignore. In the days leading up to that fateful night, Jazz had started receiving strange, anonymous threats. At first, they were subtle, untraceable messages on social media, cryptic texts. But as time went on, the tone of these messages became darker, more threatening. Jazz, accustomed to the dangers of her line of work, dismissed them. After all, in her world, threats were nothing new. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that these messages weren't just some random attempts to rattle her. The source felt closer, more personal. Still, she brushed it off, telling herself it was just part of the job, part of the territory. Chaz, however, was growing bolder. His desire for Jazz had morphed into something more sinister. He had never been shy about his intentions, but now, with every encounter, his advances grew more aggressive, more blatant. Jazz had made it clear to him, time and again, that she no longer wanted to mix business with personal matters. She had a child to raise, a future to secure, and no room for distractions. But Chaz, with his money and influence, wasn't used to being rejected, and he wasn't one to take no for an answer. That night, as Jazz prepared herself for the party, her mind was clouded with thoughts of the threats she had received and the unsettling nature of her interactions with Chaz. But was determined to carry on. She could handle whatever came her way, she convinced herself. Little did she know that that night would be the last time she would feel in control of her own life. The night Jazz was killed started like any other, filled with excitement and anticipation for the exclusive party Chaz had invited her to. She arrived at the venue, her nerves momentarily calmed by the rhythm of the night's events. But even as the champagne flowed and the guests mingled, something in the air felt off. Jazz couldn't shake the tension that had been building between her and Chaz for weeks. She had hoped that their professional relationship could remain just that, professional. But Chaz wasn't willing to let it go. Around midnight, after the last of the guests had started to leave the club, Jazz stepped outside for some air, looking for a brief escape from the chaos of the night. As she slid into her sleek black SUV, she was relieved to finally be alone, but that peace was short-lived. Chaz was waiting for her, his dark figure emerging from the shadows as he approached the car. He had a determined look in his eyes, the same one he always had when he was ready to press his agenda. What began as a casual conversation quickly escalated. Jazz had tried to keep things civil, but Chaz was relentless, pushing her to admit things she wasn't ready to say. He questioned her, demanding to know why she was pulling away from him, why she hadn't been answering his calls, and why, despite everything, she continued to resist his advances. The words were cutting, and the weight of their history, the subtle power games, the manipulation, the broken promises, hung in the air, suffocating her. Jazz tried to keep calm, trying to explain that their relationship had gone too far and that it was time for them to part ways. She had made it clear that she wanted no more of his toxic influence in her life. But with each word she spoke, Chaz grew angrier, his voice rising, the tension building with each accusation he hurled her way. He couldn't understand why she wanted to cut him off, why she couldn't just accept the life he was offering her. The argument grew more intense, more personal, with Chaz accusing Jazz of playing games, of using him to get ahead, and of turning her back on him now that she was on the brink of something bigger. But Jazz stood her ground, fighting to keep her dignity intact. It was over. No matter how hard Chaz tried to make her doubt herself, no matter how hard he pushed. But Chaz, in his rage, wasn't willing to let go so easily. His anger had reached a boiling point, and with it, all sense of reason left him. Unknown to Jazz, in the quiet shadows of the car, a hidden camera had been installed, placed there by one of Chaz's associates who had been tracking her every move for weeks. The camera captured the entire exchange in stark detail, recording every word, every moment of escalating tension. What happened next was captured in cold, chilling clarity. As the argument reached its peak, Chaz, driven by a mix of rage and desperation, lunged at Jazz, his hand reaching for her in a moment of sheer violence. Words turned to blows, and the struggle that ensued was intense. Jazz fought back, but Chaz's grip was unrelenting, his fury consuming him. Then, in an instant, a shot rang out, sharp and final. Jazz slumped over the steering wheel, her life extinguished in a flash. Her last breath was a silent cry, one that would never be heard. The hidden camera, the only witness to the moment, recorded it all. It was an unsettling interaction, revealing the deadly climax of a relationship built on power, manipulation, and toxicity. The argument had barely settled into the night's silence when the inevitable happened. Minutes after Chaz stormed off, the chaos outside the car was replaced by an eerie quiet. The city's nightlife buzzed in the distance, but Jazz was no longer part of it. Inside her SUV, the cold, sharp silence that followed her final scream was deafening. When the valet at the parking garage heard the gunshots, he thought they were fireworks at first, the kind that often echoed through the night in celebration or chaos. But then the second shot rang out, and he froze, panic clawing at his throat. He didn't know who had been shot or why, but the sound was unmistakable. His instincts kicked in, and he hurried to the spot where Jazz had parked, his heart racing in his chest. When he arrived at the car, his stomach twisted at the sight. Jazz's lifeless body was slumped over the wheel, the blood staining the seat beneath her, pooling in the space that had once been filled with so much promise and life. The bright, glamorous future Jazz had been chasing was now a dark memory, one that could never be recaptured. He quickly dialed 911, his voice trembling as he spoke into the phone. He couldn't give a description of the shooter. He hadn't seen anyone. But he had heard the shots, the deadly echo that seemed to haunt him long after the words were out of his mouth. By the time the police arrived, the scene was already locked down, the faint echo of sirens blending with the hum of the city. Detectives and officers flooded the area, combing through the details of the shooting. The car, parked in the quiet corner of the garage, was a mess of blood and shattered glass, a chilling reminder of the violence that had just unfolded. As they gathered evidence, the only tangible lead they had was a hidden camera, tucked away in a discreet corner of the car. The footage, obtained through a series of fortunate circumstances, would soon become the most critical piece of evidence in the case. It didn't show the face of the shooter, but it captured the desperation, the anger, and the fatal moment that had led to Jazz's untimely death. The footage was damning, revealing not just the struggle, but the exact moment the shot was fired. It was a raw, unfiltered truth that would haunt anyone who watched it. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the clues, all while the hidden camera footage played over and over, haunting their every move. The footage would become the key, the one thing they had to connect the dots. But even with this critical piece of evidence, the truth behind Jazz's death seemed just out of reach. Detective Alex Carter was assigned to the case, and as he arrived at the scene, the weight of the murder hit him. Jazz's lifeless body was slumped over the steering wheel of her car, the blood staining the interior, a stark reminder of the violence that had ended her promising life. The parking valet, the only witness, had heard the shots but hadn't seen anything. He was too far away to provide any details, leaving the police with little to go on. The immediate suspicion fell on those closest to Jazz. Chaz Westbrook, the powerful businessman with ties to the underworld, who had been seen arguing with her just before the shooting. Carter immediately turned his attention to him. He was the last person seen with Jazz, and the circumstances surrounding their tense relationship made him an obvious figure to investigate. When Carter interviewed Chaz, he was cool, composed, and adamant that he had nothing to do with Jazz's death. He claimed he had left the scene after their argument and had no idea what had happened to her after that. His alibi was shaky, and Carter's instincts told him there was more to the story. but without solid evidence, they couldn't make a move. Chaz was wealthy, influential, and well-connected. His denial was convincing enough to give him some leeway for now. As the investigation unfolded, Jazz's best friend, Eliza, was torn between grief and suspicion. She had lost her closest confidant, and her heart ached every day knowing that Jazz would never come home. But as the days passed, a sense of unease settled over her. Eliza started to question the people around her, including Chaz. She remembered how Jazz had distanced herself from him in the weeks before the murder, how their relationship had grown toxic. The more Eliza thought about it, the more it seemed like Chaz had been hiding something. Had Jazz's rejection of him led to her death, or was it something darker? Meanwhile, Rico Alvarez, Chaz's enforcer, was caught in a moral struggle. He had seen part of what happened that night, but his loyalty to Chaz kept him silent. Rico had always done the dirty work for Chaz, but this was different. He had never been involved in something this personal, this brutal. Guilt began to eat away at him, and he questioned whether his silence was worth the price of Jazz's life. But he was trapped. The stakes were too high, and he feared the repercussions of speaking out. As the investigation progressed, Carter began to see that the case was far more complex than a simple act of violence fueled by jealousy or rage. There were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies in the stories he was hearing. What was clear was that Jazz had been more than just a stripper. She had been involved in something deeper, something Chaz may have known about. But the evidence to make that connection was still missing. The crime scene, Jazz's car, had been meticulously processed for fingerprints, evidence of a struggle, anything that might lead them closer to the truth. It wasn't until the crime scene was examined more thoroughly hours later that something was found, something that would change everything. But for now, Carter was left with more questions than answers, knowing that the truth lay buried beneath layers of lies and secrets. The investigation was far from over, and Carter was determined to uncover the real reason behind Jazz's murder. As the investigation deepened, Detective Carter began to piece together the events of that fateful night with a clearer, albeit more disturbing, picture. The hidden camera footage had given them undeniable evidence of Chaz's involvement, but the case wasn't as closed as it seemed. There were still lingering questions, unanswered motives, elusive connections, and a trail of secrecy that refused to reveal its true face. Then, a breakthrough came. During a review of surveillance footage from nearby cameras, Carter spotted something that hadn't caught his attention before. A second vehicle had been parked near Jazz's SUV the night she was murdered. It was a sleek, high-end luxury car, an unmistakable model that stood out even in the shadows of the parking garage. After cross-referencing the vehicle's license plate, Carter made a chilling discovery. The car was registered to none other than Sophia Brooks, the prominent news anchor known for her polished reputation and tight-knit connection to Chicago's elite. Sophia had been a friend of Chaz's for years, and as Carter dug deeper into her background, he realized that her relationship with Chaz went far beyond casual acquaintanceship. The public persona she had carefully crafted didn't match the hidden ties she had to him. It was becoming clear that she knew more about Jazz's life and death than she had ever let on. Her proximity to both Chaz and the scene of the crime couldn't be a coincidence. Carter was left with a disquieting thought. Was Sophia involved in Jazz's death? And if so, why? The plot thickened further when Eliza, consumed by grief and fear for Jazz's reputation, revealed a shocking secret. In an emotional outburst, she confessed to Detective Carter that Jazz had been blackmailing Chaz. The two had a history, one that stretched back years, long before Jazz had reached the height of her fame. At the time, Chaz had made advances toward her, and while Jazz initially played along to secure her spot in his world, it soon became clear that Chaz's possessive nature wasn't something Jazz could easily escape. He had tried to control her, to make her his, and Jazz had refused. That's when Jazz found herself in a position of power. She had dirt on Chaz, secrets he wanted buried, things that could ruin him. And she had been using them to extort him for hush money. This revelation left Carter reeling. Eliza's confession painted a much darker picture of Jazz's life, one filled with manipulation, power games, and hidden dangers that had remained concealed beneath the surface. Everyone who had been close to Jazz now seemed to have their own secrets. Chaz's motives had always been clouded by his obsession with Jazz, but now it seemed his personal involvement with her had gone beyond a professional relationship. Had Jazz's blackmail pushed him to murder to protect his own empire? Or was there someone else who felt threatened by what Jazz knew? As the web of lies grew ever more tangled, Carter realized that no one in Jazz's life was entirely innocent. Each of them, from Chaz to Sophia to Eliza, now had their own reasons for being involved, and their own motives for keeping the truth buried. But the deeper Carter dug, the more he began to understand that Jazz's death was part of something much larger, a series of dangerous moves in a game none of them could escape. The investigation had reached a boiling point. Detective Carter had pieced together the fragments, but the breakthrough came when the crime scene was thoroughly re-examined. Security camera footage from the parking garage, which had been overlooked earlier, revealed something chilling. The video showed Chaz's vehicle pulling up beside Jazz's car just before the shooting, confirming that he was there at the scene. Then came the forensic evidence. Chaz's fingerprints were found all over Jazz's car. The prints were all over the steering wheel, the door, the windows, and in places that suggested he had been the one who'd handled the vehicle after the shooting. There was no denying it. Chaz had been there, and he had been involved in Jazz's death. Faced with the mounting evidence, Chaz's defenses began to crumble. He didn't immediately admit to the murder, but as Carter pressed him further, the truth started to leak out. Chaz's story remained shaky, and the weight of the security footage and his fingerprints was undeniable. It wasn't long before Chaz finally confessed to the crime, but his admission came with a chilling twist. In a desperate moment of revelation, Chaz admitted that someone else had hired him to kill Jazz. He wasn't the mastermind behind the murder, but rather a pawn in a much larger game. Chaz explained that he had been manipulated, forced into a corner by someone with the power to ruin him. His confession confirmed the suspicions that had been growing. Jazz's death wasn't just about jealousy or an argument gone wrong. It was about a deadly secret she had uncovered, one that could have brought down a criminal empire, and Chaz was merely doing the bidding of someone far more dangerous. As Carter processed this new information, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true mastermind was still out there. The threads of deception ran deep, and Chaz's confession only opened the door to a darker conspiracy, one that linked back to people who had far more to lose than Jazz had ever realized. As the investigation reached its peak, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Chaz's confession, though shocking, had only scratched the surface. The deeper Carter dug, the more he realized that someone had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And when the truth finally emerged, it was more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. The true mastermind behind Jazz's murder wasn't Chaz, as Carter had once suspected. No, the person who had orchestrated it all was none other than Sophia Brooks. The polished public figure who had long been admired for her role as a news anchor was hiding far darker secrets beneath her carefully curated image. Sophia had been closely tied to Chaz for years, but their relationship was far more complex than anyone had realized. Sophia had seen Chaz as a tool, someone who could help her climb the ranks of Chicago's elite. But when Jazz started to threaten the power dynamics, exposing secrets that could ruin everything Sophia had worked for, it became clear that eliminating Jazz was the only way to protect herself. Sophia had orchestrated the murder, using Chaz as her pawn, knowing that the loss of Jazz would destroy everything Jazz had worked for, including the potential exposure of Sophia's own dark dealings. Carter pieced together the events. Sophia had been desperate to maintain control over Chaz's rise to power, knowing that if Jazz exposed the truth, her own influence and secrets would be brought to light. By eliminating Jazz, Sophia ensured that her own empire remained intact, but at the cost of another life, a life full of promise and untold potential. In a tense final confrontation, Sophia was arrested, and the full scope of her betrayal came to light. Jazz had unwittingly become a casualty of a larger game of power and manipulation, one where the stakes were much higher than anyone had imagined. The case was closed, and Sophia faced justice, but the consequences of her actions would ripple through the lives of everyone involved. The story of Jazz's life and her tragic death lingered long after the investigation had wrapped. The Chicago nightlife scene, once a world of flashing lights and fleeting fame, would never be the same. Jazz's legacy was a complex one: her rise to fame, her struggle against powerful forces, and ultimately, her fight for control of her own story. While her murder had been solved, her memory remained, a constant reminder of the shadows that lurked beneath the glamour of the city's most exclusive circles. In the end, Jazz was more than just a victim of violence. She was a symbol of the dangers that came with power, ambition, and the fight for control. And though justice had been served, the truth had left its mark, forever altering the world Jazz had inhabited. Nothing in Chicago's nightlife scene would ever be quite the same again.